After slavery, Negro Americans faced an immense number of challenges with rebuilding their mind, their family, and their lives. The former slave himself, Mr. Booker T. Washington, viewed the condition of blacks, and he believed that the direction they were going wasn't preparing them to be independent and economically strong. So he challenged how blacks were guided, and he sought to redirect them into an education that was more practical and necessary for their advancement. Okay, so in the Booker T. Washington collection, we're going to hear more about his frustration from his 1899 writings titled The Future of the American Negro. Excellence. We have seen how the ending of slavery and the beginning of freedom produced not only a shock but a standstill, and in many cases a collapse that lasted several years in the life of many white men. This is after the Civil War in the 1860s. Southern whites who were already free and socially advantaged experienced economic and social collapse after the Union beat the system of slavery out of their society. They woke up one day and it was suddenly all over. So they panicked and had paralysis from not knowing how to function in a world that no longer was built on slave labor. If the sudden change thus affected the white man, should this not teach us that we should have more sympathy than has been shown in many cases with the Negro in connection with his new and changed life? The reason he previously pointed out the condition of the whites after slavery ended was to juxtapose their condition to the blacks. He's saying that if the whites weren't looking good after slavery ended, and they had most of the power and resources, then how much worse off would you expect the blacks to be, who had minimal power and resources? He's saying to show those blacks some compassion, that they made many mistakes, plunged into excesses, undertook responsibilities for which they were not fitted, in many cases took liberty to mean license, is not to be wondered at. None of these mistakes should be a surprise to anyone. They were unprepared for freedom, so they naturally misunderstood it and made errors along the way. It is my opinion that the next 40 years are going to show by many % a higher degree of progress in the life of the Negro along all lines than has been shown during the first 30 years of his life. Now, I would say he was partially correct with that prediction. The first 30 years, which covers from 1865 to 1895, and the next 40 from 1895 to 1935, I would say overall, blacks were in a better position and a better situation. They had done some climbing as a group, some much more than others, but as a group, still better. The literacy rates increased, more career opportunities were explored, and there were some economically successful black communities like Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So, for sure, improvements in many areas, but there were some areas where they did not show an improvement, and he will mention one of them in just a bit. Certainly, the first 30 years of the Negro's life was one of experiment, and consequently, under such conditions, he was not able to settle down to real, earnest, hard common sense efforts to better his condition. While this was true in a great many cases, on the other hand, a large proportion of the race, even from the first, saw what was needed for their new life and began to settle down to lead an industrious, frugal existence and to educate their children and in every way prepare themselves for the responsibilities of American citizenship. The wonder is that the Negro has made as few mistakes as he has when we consider all the surrounding circumstances. So Mr. Washington was actually impressed with how blacks had done, given the circumstance of having no wealth, no guidance, and no experience, and being in an extremely hostile environment created by the whites. He was surprised they had not made more mistakes, right? He was also someone who was relatively optimistic when it came to Negroes, and he had to be, given his mission and his nature of work. So the way he interpreted the situation made him believe in the future of the American Negro. Now pay attention. Columns of figures have been gleaned from the census reports within the last quarter of a century to show the great amount of crime committed by the Negro in excess of that committed by other races. This is also what Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois pointed out in an entire chapter in his 1899 book, The Philadelphia Negro. Negroes, for various reasons, have been responsible for committing more than their fair share of crime. Some of the crime being exaggerated or made up, but a significant portion was real. No one will deny the fact that the proportion of crime by the present generation of Negroes is seriously large, but I believe that any other race with the Negro's history and present environment would have shown about the same criminal record. If you take any group of people and run them through the brutal gauntlet of American slavery, then they would develop the Negro consciousness too. Then if you take those same people and put them in the same environments where Negroes ended up, especially in the city where they're very close in proximity to each other, then they would have produced a lot of criminals as well. So what we're talking about is the product of a certain mentality interacting with a particular environment to create criminals. Another consideration which we must always bear in mind in considering the Negro is that he had practically no home life in slavery. That is, the mother and father did not have the responsibility and consequently the experience of training their own children, meaning they didn't develop the skills of raising kids in the civilized world, because people need practice to do so, and they weren't able to practice. The matter of child training was left to the master and mistress, who trained them to be good, dependent, non-thinking slaves. Consequently, it has only been within the last 30 years that the Negro parents have had the actual responsibility and experience of training their own children. Now they finally got some practice. But obviously, when you first begin to practice something, you're not going to be very good at it. That they have made some mistakes in thus training them is not to be wondered at. Many families scattered over all parts of the United States have not yet been able to bring themselves together. When the Negro parents shall have had 30 or 40 additional years in which to found homes and get experience in the training of their children, I believe that we will find that the amount of crime will be considerably less than it is now shown to be. This is one area I was talking about before. In my opinion, this area did not improve for Negroes as a group. I don't think most blacks ever got good at creating families and raising kids. Many did for sure, but most did not. And obviously, as a result, the crime did not decrease considerably. It continued to rise and shoot to the moon, to the point where eventually many of these black neighborhoods in America became some of the most dangerous neighborhoods on the planet. Yes, I said on the planet. And you can see that when you look at it statistically on a neighborhood level. But we're going to touch more on this at a later time. In too large a measure, the Negro race began its development at the wrong end, simply because neither white nor black understood the case. The wrong end is referring to voting, politics, and head knowledge that didn't produce practical results. And no wonder, for there had never been such a case in the history of the world. To show where this primary mistake has led in its evil results, I wish to produce some examples showing plainly how prone we have been to make our education formal, superficial, instead of making it meet the needs of conditions. In order to emphasize the matter more fully, I repeat, at least 80% of the colored people in the South are found in the rural districts, and they are dependent on agriculture in some form for their support. Notwithstanding that we have practically a whole race dependent upon agriculture, and notwithstanding that 30 years have passed since our freedom, aside from what has been done at Hampton and Tuskegee and one or two other institutions, but very little has been attempted by state or philanthropy in the way of educating the race in this one industry upon which its very existence depends. Boys have been taken from the farms and educated in law, theology, Hebrew, and Greek, educated in everything else except the very subject that they should know most about. And remember, he's not saying that they should not get educated in these areas at all. His point is that Negroes shouldn't be taught to major in minor things. And he's also saying that Negroes needed to crawl before they walk, and walk before they run. They needed to build a strong economic foundation for themselves to become self-reliant. And farming was the way to do that, from his perspective. Without that foundation, they would become dependent on jobs from other people. And in addition, they lived in the country areas where Hebrew and Greek couldn't help in the least bit to solve the problems and improve the living conditions in that area. So what was the point of putting so much effort into it? This is what he's talking about. I question whether among all the educated colored people in the United States you can find 6, if we accept those from the institutions named, who have received anything like a thorough training in agriculture. It would have seemed that, since self-support, industrial independence is the first condition for lifting up any race, that education in theoretical and practical agriculture, horticulture, dairying, and stock raising should have occupied the first place in our system. And on top of that, they were already experienced in those fields. So he wanted them to update their education in those areas and return to the country, and then take agriculture to the next level. Then eventually, once that foundation was set, the later generations could venture off into the unrelated fields. But to put all this effort into the Hebrew and Greek, it didn't make any sense to him. A short time ago, in one of the southern cities, a colored man died who had received training as a skilled mechanic during the days of slavery. Later, by his skill in industry, he built up a great business as a house contractor and builder. In this same city, there are 35,000 colored people, among them young men who have been well educated in the languages and in literature, but not a single one could be found who had been so trained in mechanical and architectural drawing that he could carry on the business which this ex-slave had built up, and so it was soon scattered to the wind. He built it up, but nobody had the knowledge for him to pass it on to. This is also what happened a lot with real estate. My mother, she talks about how her auntie had a house fully paid for before she died. And she left it to her adult children, who eventually got the house taken from them because they didn't know anything about property taxes. You see that? And I know this has happened to many people on many occasions. People being knowledgeable on everything else, but their most relevant issues. So this is similar to what Mr. Washington is referring to. Aside from the work done in the institutions that I have mentioned, you can find almost no colored men who have been trained in the principles of architecture, notwithstanding the fact that vast majority of our race are without homes. Here, then, are the 3 prime conditions for growth, for civilization: food, clothing, shelter. And yet we have been the slaves of forms and customs to such an extent that we have failed in a large measure to look matters squarely in the face and meet actual needs. They focused on tradition, status, and appearances, but not enough on doing the gritty work that was right in front of them and needed to be done. So we can see the frustration experienced by Mr. Washington as we get more of an understanding on his point of view. And what we're going to do is we're going to pick back up and finish the rest of the half of this chapter in the next commentary. And so I thank you for your time and attention. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.